pieces were coming together and kind of pulling me apart inside. And with my own sense I was wrestling with my own sense of self-worth. And in the spring of 2009, Jameson was born. Happy birthday. It's not really his birthday, but that was February 2009. And around the same time, I failed Greek, right? And we were out of money, and I was like, maybe I'm not meant to be a minister, like clearly something is out of place right here. So I walked into a recruiter's office. First I tried the Air Force, and they didn't get back to me. And then I tried the Navy, and they told me it was a 6-month wait. And then I had a choice between the Army and the Marines, so I walked into an Army recruiter, and he was like, there's a war going on, right? And I was like, yeah. I was like, I need a job. And he's like, we have those. Here's paper. I was like, no waiting period. We'll take you right now, So I joined the Army, and I needed a reset. I needed time to clear my head. And to be honest, I was trying to escape. All of those difficulties and all those wranglings and all those things that I was wrestling with. I was definitely trying to escape the Greek. And as the son of 2 soldiers, I had wanted to serve since I was a kid, and this is probably my last chance to do so. I was already kind of getting up there a little bit. And so I joined up and put the idea of ministry behind me. I didn't realize at that time that God had very different plans for me, or that he would use my little theological freakout, as I like to call it, for his purposes, or that I would experience such a depth of love and grace through the call that God has given me and the people I've encountered along the way. I had no idea that those things were in store for me, in the future for me. But I did learn a very hard lesson in all of this, and I think it's a lesson that Abraham, or Abram, as he was still called in our passage this morning, learned as well on his journey to be obedient to God's call. And I do want to clarify, when I went back to seminary, once I had received my call, I actually aced Greek and I aced Hebrew. So I think it was a lot of it was mental, just that struggle. And also I grew up a little bit. If there's one thing to be said about the Army, is they'll grow you up fast. So I was a little bit more mature. But it's when the promises of God seem so far away from being fulfilled, when it seems like we've been abandoned to fend for ourselves in a hostile world, that's when we need to rely on God's grace the most. And that's what our story is about this morning. So when we left off with Abram's journey last week, he had been called out of the land of Ur of the Chaldees, the land of Babylon, and the heart of the most ancient civilization in the world. I talked a little bit about the Sumerian civilization, which is a lot of fun to research, by the way. I had a blast with that little part of the sermon prep last week. But in a pattern of conflict and separation which emerges in these early chapters of Genesis, beginning with the Tower of Babel and Abram's very own homeland, we see God beginning to separate peoples and nations from one another, then families and clans from nations, and finally one man and his household from his family and clan, as he is called by God in Genesis 12, 1-3, to go from your country, go from your kindred, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now last week we parsed out exactly what that promise of blessing meant for Abram and what it means for us today. But what do we do when the promise is threatened by seemingly irresistible forces? Where is God when fierce resistance is encountered on every side? I think right now there are a lot of people in our culture asking these questions. Where is God in the midst of all of this upheaval? Whose side is he on? Because in almost every conflict in human history, they tend to claim God for their own side, don't they? And so that's something that we need to discern. That's something that we need to ask God for the wisdom for. So today we're going to dig into the scripture, hopefully to find out a little bit more about that. Our passage this morning begins with Genesis 12:10 with the statement, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land." Now when we read these words from a place of relative plenty and security in America in the 21st century, it can be difficult to realize, difficult for us to really grasp what Abram and his household were experiencing and what they must have been thinking. Right? I mean, we think we know what a famine is like, but until you've really been hungry and you really face the possibility of starvation, I don't think we can really know what that was like. We are aware of famines. We are aware that they exist. They've existed in the past. We are aware that people in far-flung places in the world are starving. But I think many of us forget that the reality of starvation and malnutrition is much closer than we think. Even today, often hidden from sight or mind, there are over 13 million children in the U.S. alone who may not get to eat today. Now, that's not what my sermon is about this morning, but that actually shocked me today, or this week as I was preparing for this sermon. 13 million in the richest country on the planet. 13 million kids, that's not even adults, don't know where their next meal is going to come from, if they will get one. Hunger and the threat of hunger are always closer than we think, and this was especially true for a nomadic herdsman in the ancient Near East. In Abram's day, a man's wealth was measured in sheep, in servants, and in sons. And all of these need to eat, right? All three of those need to eat. They all need fresh water to drink. They didn't pack grain with them, right? Because they were moving around from place to place, so you couldn't haul like a big old grain silo with you. So they had to go where the pastures were greenest. They had to go where wells could be dug. They had to go where streams were flowing. And if they had any gold or silver, it was probably on what they were wearing. That's often how nomadic tribes carried wealth. They just wear it on their bodies. So when the grass withers in the sun and the river beds and wells dry up, that wealth can disappear in a matter of weeks. And if a herdsman didn't find greener pastures quickly enough, he and his whole family were going to starve to death. This is exactly what Abram must have feared as he stood on the parched plains of Canaan, contemplating his next move. God had sent him to this land, had promised it to his descendants, and no sooner than he arrived, he has to leave or he's going to die. How discouraging is that? Because he gave up a lot, right? He left a lot behind. He left all that security of that ancient civilization behind into an unknown land where he doesn't have any friends, occupied by people who probably don't want their limited resources taken by yet another herdsman. And now he has to leave. I wonder if he doubted. I wonder if he questioned. If he tried bargaining with God as he would later do when pleading for the people of Sodom. We don't know, right? It doesn't tell us maybe what he was thinking. But we do know that in verse 8, after receiving and responding obediently to the call and promise of God, he built an altar between Bethel and Ai, which is in the north of Israel, and invoked the name of the Lord. We know that he called out to God, whether in praise or direction for what to do next, we don't know. And we don't know how God responded, but we do know that he called out to God. We also know that because, as verse 10 says, the famine was severe in the land, that Abram was desperate, right? I mean, the verse really, it covers it really briefly, but it says it twice. It really wants you to know that this is a serious situation. And out of desperation, he is headed to the greener pastures of Egypt, continually fled by the abundant waters of the Nile, powerful and ancient almost beyond imagination. By the time Abram had arrived at its borders, pharaohs had ruled as gods over the land for 1,400 years, and the pyramids had towered over the most powerful civilization on the planet for centuries. Right? Egypt was kind of the envy of the world, and at this time there weren't a whole lot of civilizations to go around. I mean, it had a reputation as this powerful, ancient kingdom. And Abram was entering as an insignificant Hebrew. His household was probably one of many refugees crowding the borders to escape the famine. I mean, I'm sure he wasn't the only one with the idea to go down to Egypt at that time. But the future of humanity rested on the shoulders of this seemingly insignificant refugee. We need to think about that. Everybody knew who Egypt was at that time. Nobody knew who Abram was. But God was with Abram. He knew the Egyptians were dangerous, and he knew that they wouldn't hesitate to take what they needed. So before they entered the land, he asks his wife for what I would call a pretty big favor, right? Verses 11 through 13 tells us that when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance," which is a nice compliment, right? That's how you should always start a conversation with your spouse. When you're going to ask a big favor. It's smart. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "Well, this is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life might be spared on your account. That's a weird request, isn't it? The text doesn't tell us what she must have been thinking. This is where I wish maybe I don't know, we got some more insights into what they were thinking, because I don't even know, I don't know what Marsha would say if I asked you that. You'd be like, what are you talking about? So, the text doesn't tell us what she must have been thinking, and I wish it really did, because I think most spouses would probably have been offended by such a request. Now, I have no idea why Abram jumped to the startling conclusion that they would try to kill him so that they could steal his wife. I mean, that's not usually the first thing that pops into my head when I go to a new place. And it seems like a pretty startling conclusion. I mean, did the Egyptians have a reputation for this kind of thing? We don't know. But I think we get some clue as to what he was thinking when he encounters a similar threat while sojourning with the Philistines and King Abimelech of Gerar, in chapter 20, where in verse 11 he tells the king, I did it because I thought there's no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. The fear of God, right? The fear of being on the right side of God. He knew that this is an ancient and powerful civilization. He probably knew that the pharaohs were worshipped as gods themselves. And so he knew that when men put themselves up as gods, there's not anything that they won't do to satisfy their own selfish desires. Already we see a pattern emerging in Abram's actions. Instead of trusting God with the outcome, Abram, being a pragmatic man, fully aware of the dangers he is facing, makes pragmatic decisions which are starting to get him into trouble. Apparently his fears weren't totally unfounded, because verses 14 through 16 tells us when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, female and male slaves, female donkeys, and camels. The Egyptians indeed noticed Sarai's beauty and take her to be a member of Pharaoh's harem. That's another way of saying harem. We don't know if they would have killed Abram for her, right? We don't actually know if his fear was well-founded there. But the promise of an inheritance for Abram's descendants must have seemed like an impossibility now. Right? It's almost like he just gave that away. Sarai would have needed to go through a lengthy purification process, lasting weeks or months before she ever would have seen Pharaoh. This I actually thought was very interesting. That this isn't just like Pharaoh's like, oh, I got a new wife, and he goes to see her the next day. This is a big, I almost want to say an industrial operation in its scope. And given the vast number of wives and concubines that these pharaohs were known to have, I looked it up, and Ramses II had 200 wives and concubines. He had 96 sons and 60 daughters, right? So I don't think he could have even possibly known all their names. Right? It's crazy how many there were. So Sarah was little more than an addition to the pharaoh's collection, meant to add to his prestige and fame. The women of Pharaoh's harem were little more than trophies, glittering jewels in his treasury, and pawns to be leveraged in treaties and relations with other nations. That's what this was all about. It was all about Pharaoh's operation, Pharaoh's continued prestige, his continued glory at the expense of others. But for Abram, Sarai was everything. She was the wife he loved, and it hadn't mattered that she was barren. And it must have broken his heart when they took her away, and we can only imagine the heartache which he experienced. I actually think, in a way, maybe it makes sense not to put that into words, because there are no words which could give voice to what he must have been feeling, and the cry of his heart to God in that moment of despair. So far from the land God had promised him, so far from any reasonable hope that he would ever come back there with his family intact. But the wonderful thing about our God is that when he makes a promise, he keeps it. Amen? Amen. I want to say that again. The wonderful thing about our God is that when he makes a promise, he keeps it. Amen. And no human scheming or deceptions or misguided decision-making can derail his purposes. God always plans for the long game. Even from the beginnings of Genesis, he had not only the deliverance of his chosen people in mind, but the deliverance of all nations who would be redeemed by the coming Messiah. We get a hint of this in the next verses in 12:17 through 13:1, where it's written, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' until I took her to be my wife?" I feel like Pharaoh's understandably upset here. I don't think he's being unreasonable. "Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone." And Pharaoh and his men Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they sent him on his way with his wife and all that he had. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Through plagues, and if chapter 20 is any indication, dreams, Pharaoh is made to realize that he's crossed the wrong man and he's crossed the wrong God. Right? And that despite his ambitions, Pharaoh isn't nearly as powerful and divine as he claims to be. I think Pharaoh had a little bit of an awakening there, didn't he? He had a little bit of a wake-up call in this process. He immediately gives Sarai back and makes Abram wealthy in an effort to placate him and his God, and in doing so, he comes off as more righteous and honorable than Abram did. Right through this whole thing, it's interesting that the one chosen by God to carry his promise is actually less faithful and righteous at this point in the story than this pagan king that Abram was so afraid of. We should be thankful, and I'm sure that Abram was, that God's faithfulness is not dependent on our own. When God promises something, he will do it. He will do it on his terms and on his conditions, and we are invited to enter into that promise. We get to decide whether we're going to trust God with that promise or not. He invites us in. He doesn't force us. But at the same time, God is going to do what he set out to do. And I'm not sure whether you've noticed or not, but this story echoes another story which most of you are probably familiar with, that of the Exodus. Commentators have noted that there are at least 20 explicit phrases which are repeated both in this story and the story of Joseph's descent into Egypt and the deliverance of Israel out of Egypt. In some of the commentaries I read, they actually have them listed right next to each other. And it's 20 places where it's word for word down the line. As one commentator noted, the whole of God's plan from beginning to end is thus contained within the scope of this simple story. Right? A writer doesn't do that by accident. A writer doesn't do that because they don't want you to notice. It's important. There's a reason that's in the text. And this fits another pattern in the book of Genesis and the Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Bible. In general, the use of parallel and repeated narratives. I don't know if any of you have noticed that, but it seems like we're encountering sort of the same themes again and again, and the same stories again and again. There's a reason the story of Cain and Abel parallels Adam and Eve's expulsion from the garden, even down to the conversation with God and the curse that follows, and then the mercy shown to the party afterwards. There's a reason Abraham's story parallels Isaac, and then later Israel's. And that reason is explained later in Genesis 41:32, when Joseph interprets different Pharaoh's own parallel dreams by saying, "And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about." These parallels exist in the biblical story because again and again, we who are so short-sighted and practical in our outlook often miss that big picture. We miss the long game that God has in mind. We need to be reminded again and again and again that our God is faithful even when we see no possible way out of our situation. Our hope is bright even when we are surrounded by darkness. Is there a puppy that wants one? I love puppies. Anyway. Our hope is bright even when we are surrounded by darkness, and God's promises are fixed. If that puppy needs water, we can give him some water. I don't know, somebody will take care of that. Sorry. God's promises are fixed and sure, and God will surely bring about their fulfillment. That's why these stories are paralleled again and again. That's why they're told over and over and over. God sees that long game, and he needs to remind his people again and again that he's got that long game in mind. That he is faithful. His promises are fixed and sure, and God will surely bring about their fulfillment. But no sooner does Abram return with his family intact into Canaan than that promise is threatened again. So this is why I put these two stories together in this morning's sermon. Normally I kind of break them up, and we go story by story. But again, we have a lot of parallels here. And so I really feel like I needed to preach on both of these stories at once to give you a better idea of the whole picture of what's happening. So Abram comes back out of Egypt. He's been delivered by God, right? Miraculously so, because what was impossible, days, weeks before, is now back in his hands. God has been faithful, and he's coming back to the promised land, but now it's threatened again. Genesis 13:2-7 tells us, now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together, for the possessions were so great that they could not live together, and there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. So, this time, there's a little bit of a subtle difference. I don't know if you all noticed this. This time, when Abram returns, he seeks the face of the Lord. Right? As soon as he gets back. Now, we don't know what Abram said to God or what he asked God for. There's details there that are missing. But we see a subtle growing maturity in him, and a maturity that we are about to see is sorely lacking in Lot. The irony here is that the very prosperity brought about by God's fulfillment of his promises by delivering Abram's household from Egypt has now put that promise in jeopardy again. There's a certain irony there, right? Like, he's wealthy, he's coming back to the land, and because of that wealth, the promise is threatened again. He's so prosperous, his herds are so numerous, his servants so many, that the land can't support them. They're fighting over water, and a war threatens to break out within his own household. So he says to Lot in verses 8-10, let there be no strife between you and me, between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, I will go to the left. Now, custom at the time really dictated that Lot should have refused to make the decision himself and instead should have deferred to his uncle. And such a custom might be foreign to us, right? Because we're used to, if somebody offers us something, we take it, right? That's kind of what we do. But even in the Middle East today, one of the things that I learned is if somebody offers something to you, like say they offer to, I don't know, buy you lunch or something, you go for a bounty, and they're like, let me pay for it. You're supposed to refuse, and then they offer again, and then you refuse again, and then when they offer the third time, that means it's genuine and you accept. So if they only offer once and you say, no, I'll take care of it, and they're like, okay, then that really means they weren't really offering to begin with, they were just trying to be polite. And that's the custom. So if you don't offer to buy lunch for the other person, you're actually being kind of rude. They're not actually expecting you to pay for them. They're just expecting you to offer. So there's this kind of interesting dynamic, and I feel like when Americans go overseas, we totally miss it. And they're like, let me offer you, lunch. And you're like, yeah, buy me lunch, this is great. And they're like, oh, wait. So that's what the custom would have dictated at the time. But Lot doesn't care about custom, right? He doesn't say, oh, no, uncle, you decide. You tell me where I should go. Let me defer to your wisdom. That also would have been the wise thing to do, right? To listen to his uncle's wisdom. But instead, he sees the land with pragmatic eyes. He surveys the land with pragmatic eyes and makes a pragmatic decision. Hey, buddy.
Well, hello.
You really wanted to come listen.
Okay, that's great. Yeah.
Is this somebody's dog?
I don't know. I mean, somebody probably owns this dog. Well, God created animals and he loves them, so
We did.
figure out where to put them. Thank you. I really appreciate you ladies for taking care of that. Instead, Lot surveys the land with pragmatic eyes and makes a pragmatic decision. He doesn't defer to his uncle. He doesn't ask for his uncle's wisdom. He's like, I've got a golden opportunity here, and I'm going to take it. Right? He will take the best land for himself and for his herds. And so if we read verses 11 through 13, sorry, I got a little distracted. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from one another. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord. So Lot, he doesn't view the land with God's eyes. Right? He doesn't view the land with an idea of God's promise in mind, even though he has experienced God's promise so far. Because remember, Abram has journeyed Lot up to this point. Right? Lot has seen everything that God has already done for Abram, and Lot should know better. But where Abram is learning, right? Abram is seeking the Lord, and he's slowly learning. He's slowly coming to a realization of what God is like. Lot is still, he's young. He's still doing his own thing. And so he jumps at that opportunity. He jumps at the chance to get ahead, even at the expense of the man who took him under his wing when Lot's own father had died. And so verse 11 tells us that Lot journeyed eastward, and thus they separated from one another. Again, conflict brings separation. And because Lot could only see things through selfish eyes, he continued eastward. Just like when Adam and Eve, they went eastward. When Cain killed Abel, and he received a curse and the mercy of God, he traveled eastward. And now Lot is following in their footsteps, traveling eastward, traveling further and further away from the promises of God. Ever eastward, ever farther from God's grace, and ever toward the enticing promise of prosperity and power at the expense of others, which this world so often tempts us with. Abraham, now that God has Abram's attention, now that even Lot has been separated from Abram, God reiterates his promise to Abram in verse 14, where the Lord says to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oak and built another altar to the Lord. See, once that conflict has happened again, once that separation has happened again, common theme throughout Genesis, God again reiterates his promise, but he expands it. He makes it even better. He invites Abram to take a look at the land, not with the eyes of Lot, because when Lot looked at the land, remember, he saw all this land over here, and it looked dingy and dry and awful. It was probably still recovering from a famine. And he saw this land over here, and it was green, and he didn't care that the people were wicked. As the story progressed, we're actually going to see a progression in Lot. First, he sets up his tent near Sodom, and then he gets closer in proximity to it. And then when we find him next, he's living in Sodom, and then he lingers in Sodom. So he's kind of going down his own path, further and further away from God's promises. But Abram has learned to see with God's eyes, because he's experienced God's grace firsthand. He's experienced God's miraculous power. And so I think when God invites Abram to look at the land, to look northward and southward, eastward and westward, he invites him not to see with his natural eyes. Because even from a very big hilltop, you can see pretty far. But you can't see the whole thing. God is inviting him to look with the eyes of faith. And the eyes of faith look farther than